I walked into Master Rodriguez's dojo that Tuesday evening, expecting nothing more than my usual training session. The familiar scent of rubber mats and decades of sweat greeted me as I changed into my GI, the same ritual I'd followed for 3 years now. At 42, I wasn't the fastest or strongest student, but I showed up consistently, paid my dues, and minded my own business. That should have been enough. But apparently, being a middle-aged woman in a martial arts gym makes you an easy target for certain types of men who mistake politeness for weakness. The black belt testing was scheduled for the following month, and tensions were running high among the advanced students. Marcus Thompson, a third-degree black belt, with shoulders like a linebacker and an ego to match, had been strutting around the dojo for weeks like he owned the place. He'd earned his rank fair and square, I'll give him that, but somewhere along the way he'd forgotten that martial arts was supposed to teach humility along with technique. I was stretching near the back wall when I heard him talking to his usual crew of admirers, his voice carrying that particular tone men use when they want everyone to hear how clever they think they're being. "You know what this place needs?" Marcus said, loud enough for half the dojo to hear. "Some real sparring, not this touch tag stuff we do with the beginners." His eyes found mine across the room, and I felt that familiar chill that comes when you realize you've become someone's entertainment. Maybe we should invite some of the recreational students to step up. See what they're really made of. The conversation around him died down as other students sensed the shift in energy. Master Rodriguez was in his office handling paperwork, blissfully unaware of what was brewing on his training floor. I continued my stretching routine, keeping my expression neutral even as my pulse quickened. I'd dealt with bullies before, in boardrooms and PTA meetings, but there was something particularly insidious about this kind of challenge. It was wrapped in the language of martial arts tradition, disguised as an invitation to grow, but underneath it was pure, predatory instinct. Marcus pushed off from the wall where he'd been leaning and walked over to where I was sitting. His footsteps on the mat were deliberately heavy, announcing his approach like a drumbeat. The other students tried to look busy with their own training, but I could feel their attention like heat lamps. "Sarah?" he said, using the overly friendly tone adults use when they're about to ask children to do something they don't want to do. "I was just thinking, you've been training here for 3 years now? Maybe it's time you tested yourself against some real resistance." I looked up at him slowly, taking my time to fold my legs out of the stretch position. 3 years of training had taught me more than just how to throw punches and escape holds. I'd learned to read people, to sense the difference between genuine challenge and calculated humiliation. Marcus was definitely in the latter category. "I appreciate the thought," I said, my voice steady and polite. "But I'm quite comfortable with my current training level." The smile that spread across his face was the kind sharks probably wear right before they bite. "Come on, don't be modest. Everyone here knows you've got heart. And heart matters more than technique, right?" He glanced around at his audience, making sure they were paying attention to his performance. Besides, it would be good for the other students to see that martial arts isn't about age or size. It's about spirit. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. He was using the very principles Master Rodriguez taught us about inner strength and determination as weapons against me, twisting philosophy into peer pressure. But here's what Marcus didn't know about me, what none of them knew. I hadn't always been a suburban mom taking evening karate classes. Before my daughter was born, before my marriage, before I traded my old life for carpools and soccer practices, I had a very different kind of education. 8 years in the military will teach you things that don't show up on a dojo resume. 2 tours overseas will show you what real violence looks like, and it doesn't resemble anything that happens in a controlled sparring match. I'd kept that part of my life private, not out of shame, but out of respect for the peaceful intentions of recreational martial arts. These people were here to exercise, build confidence, maybe learn some basic self-defense. They weren't here to encounter someone who'd been trained to end fights quickly and permanently. But Marcus's little performance was pushing me toward a line I'd hoped never to cross again. "I really don't think that's necessary," I said, standing up slowly. At 5'6", I had to look up at his 6'2" frame, but I'd learned long ago that physical height had nothing to do with who held the power in a confrontation. Maybe another time. The dismissal in my voice was clear, at least to me. But Marcus either didn't hear it or chose to ignore it. He stepped closer, using his size to crowd my personal space in a way that would look casual to observers, but felt threatening to me. It was a classic dominance move, the kind bullies use when they want to escalate without appearing to be the aggressor. "Come on, Sarah," he pressed, his voice taking on a wheedling quality that made my skin crawl. "Just a quick session. Light contact, nothing serious. What's the worst that could happen?" That question hung in the air between us like a challenge flag. What's the worst that could happen? He had no idea what he was asking, no concept of the memories he was stirring up, or the training he was about to encounter. The worst that could happen was that I would stop pretending to be just another suburban mom playing at martial arts, and show him exactly what 8 years of military combat training looked like when deployed against a target. But I tried one more time to de-escalate, because despite everything, I genuinely didn't want to hurt him. "Marcus, I appreciate your confidence in me, but I'm really not interested in sparring tonight." The laughter that erupted from his little group of followers was like fingernails on a chalkboard. One of them, a brown belt named Jake, who'd been riding Marcus's coattails since day one, actually slapped his knee like this was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Oh, come on, Sarah," Jake chimed in, emboldened by his hero's example. "We promise we'll go easy on you." And there it was, the final insult wrapped in mock kindness. They'd go easy on me, like I was a child who needed their protection, a fragile thing to be handled with care lest I break. The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it. I felt something shift inside me, a familiar coldness that I'd spent years learning to suppress. It was the same feeling I'd gotten in that dusty compound outside Kandahar when the insurgent had pointed his rifle at my squad leader, the same deadly calm that had descended when our convoy hit that IED, and I'd had to drag 3 wounded soldiers to safety under fire. It was the part of me that understood violence not as a sport or an art form, but as a tool to be used when all other options were exhausted. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings, reminding me that this was a suburban dojo, not a battlefield, that Marcus was an arrogant fool, not an enemy combatant. But the part of me that had been trained to respond to threats was already calculating angles, measuring distances, cataloging vulnerabilities. Marcus must have seen something change in my expression because his cocky smile faltered slightly. But he'd committed to this course of action in front of his audience, and backing down now would cost him the very dominance he was trying to establish. So he doubled down, the way bullies always do when they sense their victim might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. "Tell you what," he said, his voice getting louder to make sure everyone in the dojo could hear. "If you can land just one clean hit on me, I'll admit that technique beats strength every time. But if you can't," he shrugged, leaving the implication hanging. The challenge was now public, witnessed by a dozen other students. I could feel their eyes on me, measuring my response, waiting to see if I would submit to the pressure or find some graceful way to escape. But Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that my reluctance came from fear, that I was backing down because I knew I couldn't win. In reality, I'd been trying to protect him from the consequences of his own arrogance. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could hear the soft sounds of other students practicing their forms in the distance, the whisper of fabric against skin, the controlled breathing of people lost in their individual pursuits. Normal sounds from a normal evening that was about to become very abnormal indeed. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd become my training partners and, in some cases, friends over the past 3 years. Most of them looked uncomfortable with the situation, but none were willing to speak up and risk becoming Marcus's next target. That's how bullies maintain their power, by making everyone complicit in their cruelty through silence. Finally, I nodded slowly, my decision made. "All right, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dojo. "1 round. Light contact, as you said." The smile that spread across his face was triumphant, the expression of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. He began talking to his friends about how this would be good for me, how facing your fears was part of martial arts growth, how he was really doing me a favor by forcing me out of my comfort zone. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was watching his body language, noting how he carried his weight, how he held his shoulders, the way his feet were positioned. I was cataloging everything I needed to know to end this as quickly and safely as possible. Because despite his assumptions, I wasn't afraid of losing this fight. I was terrified of what might happen when I won. Master Rodriguez chose that moment to emerge from his office, drawn by the unusual quiet that had settled over his normally bustling dojo. He took in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd been teaching martial arts for 30 years, immediately sensing the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order. Marcus stepped forward, his role as instigator making him the natural spokesman. "Just some friendly sparring, Master Rodriguez. Sarah here was interested in testing her skills against some of the advanced students." The lie was so smooth it almost sounded believable, if you didn't know the context. But I could see in Master Rodriguez's eyes that he sensed something was off, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on what. His gaze moved between Marcus and me, trying to read the undercurrents of the situation. "Is that right, Sarah?" he asked, giving me an opportunity to clarify or back out gracefully. I appreciated his attempt to defuse the situation, but it was too late for that now. The challenge had been made publicly, and my credibility as a student in this dojo hung in the balance. If I backed down now, every future class would be colored by this moment, every technique practiced under the shadow of Marcus's triumphant smirk. More importantly, other students would learn that bullying worked, that public humiliation was an acceptable way to establish dominance. I couldn't let that stand. "That's right, Master Rodriguez," I confirmed, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through my veins. "Just a friendly sparring session to help with my training." He studied my face for a long moment, and I wondered if he could see past the suburban mom exterior to the soldier underneath. Master Rodriguez had served in Vietnam, I knew, and there was something in his expression that suggested he recognized something familiar in my sudden calm. But he nodded slowly and gestured toward the main sparring area. "Very well. Standard dojo rules apply. Light contact only, stop immediately when I call halt, and remember that this is about learning, not winning." Marcus practically bounced on his toes as we moved to the center of the mat, his excitement poorly contained. He began stretching ostentatiously, putting on a show for our audience as he loosened up his considerable frame. The performance was designed to intimidate, to remind everyone present of his physical advantages and superior rank. But as I settled into my own pre-fight routine, I wasn't thinking about his size or his belt color or the impressive array of trophies he'd won at various tournaments. I was thinking about a night 3 years into my first deployment when our base came under mortar attack, and I'd had to neutralize 2 insurgents in hand-to-hand combat while evacuating wounded personnel. I was remembering the weight of full combat gear and how it felt to fight for your life when failure meant not just personal defeat, but the death of people counting on you for protection. Marcus finished his stretching routine and faced me across the mat, settling into a traditional fighting stance that looked like it had been lifted straight from a martial arts textbook. His form was technically perfect, every angle precise, every muscle properly engaged. It was the stance of someone who'd spent years perfecting his technique in controlled environments against cooperative training partners. It was also completely inadequate for what was about to happen to him. "Ready when you are," he said, that same condescending smile playing around his lips. He was still thinking of this as entertainment, a chance to demonstrate his superiority while teaching the uppity middle-aged lady her place in the dojo hierarchy. Master Rodriguez positioned himself at the edge of the mat, his hand raised to signal the start of the match. "Fighters ready?" We both nodded. "Begin." Marcus moved first, which was exactly what I'd expected. Bullies always like to set the pace, to be the aggressor who forces their opponent to react. He came forward with a textbook combination, a jab followed by a low kick, both delivered with the kind of controlled power appropriate for light sparring. It was technically sound, properly executed, and completely telegraphed from about 3 moves back. I stepped off the center line, letting his punch slide past my shoulder while simultaneously checking his kick with my shin. The counter was so automatic I barely had to think about it, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training taking over. But instead of following up immediately, I held back, giving him a chance to reset and try again. I was still hoping this could end without anyone getting hurt. Marcus looked surprised that I'd defended so easily, but he covered it with a laugh. "Not bad," he said as if he were grading a student's homework. "Let's try that again." His second attack was more aggressive, a combination of punches designed to overwhelm my defense through sheer volume. But speed and power without intelligence are just wasted energy, and Marcus was fighting like someone who'd never faced a truly dangerous opponent. Every technique was broadcast in advance, every transition signaled by subtle shifts in weight and breathing that might as well have been neon signs. I slipped the first punch, parried the second, and ducked under the third, staying just outside the range of his follow-up kicks. My movement was economical, precise, using the minimum energy necessary to avoid his attacks. But I could see the frustration building in his eyes, as none of his techniques found their mark. This wasn't going according to his script. The audience was getting restless too. They'd expected to see their champion easily handle the presumptuous amateur, not watch him flail uselessly while I danced around his attacks like smoke. Some of the more perceptive students were beginning to look at me with new eyes, wondering where this defensive skill had come from and why I'd been hiding it during regular training sessions. "Stand still and fight," Marcus muttered, loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. The mask of friendly sparring was beginning to slip, revealing the ugly truth underneath. This had never been about helping me improve or demonstrating martial arts principles. It had been about putting me in my place, and my refusal to cooperate was making him look foolish in front of his audience. I decided it was time to end this, before his frustration led him to escalate beyond the bounds of safe sparring. Marcus launched another combination, this one with more power behind it than the light contact we'd agreed upon. His control was slipping as his anger grew, and I could see we were approaching the point where someone was going to get hurt if I didn't take decisive action. As his right cross came toward my face, I made my move. Instead of simply evading, I stepped inside his guard, catching his extended arm and using his own momentum to guide him into a hip throw that would have been at home in any judo competition. But this wasn't sport judo, and I wasn't interested in points or style. This was a combat application of principles I'd learned when my life depended on ending fights quickly. Marcus hit the mat hard, his breath leaving him in a surprised whoosh, as 3 years of assumed superiority evaporated in the space of 2 seconds. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the suddenly silent dojo like a gunshot. But I wasn't done yet. Before he could recover or even fully process what had happened, I followed him down, transitioning smoothly into a submission hold that pinned him face first against the mat, with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested very bad things would happen if he tried to move. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 5 seconds from start to finish, executed with a fluidity that spoke of training far beyond anything offered in recreational martial arts classes. The silence in the dojo was deafening. I could hear Marcus's labored breathing beneath me, feel the tension in his body as he realized he was completely helpless. His friends stood frozen at the edge of the mat, their expressions cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning understanding. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. "Do you yield?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the stunned silence. For a moment, Marcus said nothing, his pride warring with the very real physical discomfort of his position. I could feel him testing the hold, looking for an escape that didn't exist, gradually coming to terms with the reality of his situation. Finally, his voice came out in a strained whisper. "I yield." I released him immediately and stepped back, giving him space to recover his dignity along with his breath. As he pushed himself up from the mat, I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, trying to process what had just happened and figure out how to salvage his reputation from this disaster. Master Rodriguez approached us both, his expression unreadable. "Interesting technique," he said, looking directly at me. "Where did you learn that particular combination?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge of its own. This was my chance to come clean, to explain the background that had made this outcome inevitable from the moment Marcus issued his challenge. But I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not here, not now, not in front of an audience that was already struggling to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with their preconceptions about who I was supposed to be. "I've been doing some supplemental training," I said, which was technically true if you considered 8 years of military service supplemental to suburban karate classes. Reading books, watching videos, that sort of thing. It was a weak explanation, and everyone knew it, but it was the best I could offer without opening a much larger can of worms. Marcus had made it back to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, and something that might have been anger, or might have been fear. "Lucky shot," he muttered, loud enough for his friends to hear. "Caught me off guard." The excuse was pathetic, but I understood the psychological necessity of it. Marcus's entire identity in this place was built around his status as a superior fighter, a teacher, a man who commanded respect through martial prowess. What had just happened threatened all of that, and his ego was scrambling to find some explanation that didn't involve admitting he'd been completely outclassed by a woman he dismissed as an easy target. I could have corrected him, could have pointed out that luck had nothing to do with years of intensive training and real-world application, but there was no point in humiliating him further, and besides, I had my own reputation to consider. The less attention this incident attracted, the better for everyone involved. "Good match," I said instead, extending my hand in the traditional gesture of respect between training partners. Marcus looked at my outstretched hand for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could refuse the handshake, making his poor sportsmanship obvious to everyone present, or he could swallow his pride and maintain the fiction that this had been just a friendly sparring session between equals. He took my hand reluctantly, his grip firmer than necessary, a petty attempt to reassert some measure of dominance. But the damage was done, and we both knew it. The other students began to disperse, returning to their individual training, with the careful deliberation of people trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about power dynamics in their familiar environment. But I could feel their eyes on me throughout the rest of the class, measuring looks that suggested my days of anonymity were over. As I packed up my gear at the end of the session, Master Rodriguez approached me one more time. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I'd like to have a word with you before you leave." I nodded, having expected this conversation was inevitable. We waited until the last student had left, leaving us alone in the dojo, with only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the lingering scent of exertion and adrenaline. "That was some impressive technique tonight," he began, settling onto one of the benches that lined the wall. "The kind of training that comes from somewhere other than books and videos." I sat down beside him, suddenly feeling every one of my 42 years. "Master Rodriguez, Please," he interrupted gently. "Just call me Jim. I think we're past the need for formal titles at this point." He was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the kind of attention that made me wonder what he was seeing there. "You served, didn't you?" The question was asked so softly I almost didn't hear it, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Jim had recognized something in my movement, in the way I'd approached the confrontation with Marcus, that spoke to experiences shared by those who'd been places most people never go. I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Army. 8 years, 2 deployments. Combat?" Another nod. "Infantry support. Convoy security. Base defense. Some other things I'd rather not discuss." Jim was quiet for a long time, absorbing this information and probably reassessing every interaction we'd had over the past 3 years. Finally, he spoke again, his voice heavy with understanding. "That explains a lot. The way you move, the way you watch people, the way you stayed so calm tonight when most people would have been terrified." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Marcus had no idea what he was walking into, did he? "No," I agreed, and I tried to warn him in my own way. But he wasn't listening. "Men like Marcus rarely do," Jim said with a sigh. "They mistake confidence for competence and assume that physical size translates to fighting ability. Tonight was probably the first time anyone's ever shown him how wrong those assumptions can be." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 veterans processing the evening's events through the lens of shared experience. Finally, Jim turned to face me directly. "So what happens now? Marcus isn't going to just forget about this, and his pride is going to demand some kind of response. Are you prepared for that?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself throughout the evening. Marcus's humiliation tonight had been public and complete, witnessed by people whose respect he valued and needed to maintain his position in the dojo's social hierarchy. That kind of damage doesn't heal quickly or quietly, and men like Marcus have a tendency to nurse grudges until they fester into something more dangerous. I hope it doesn't come to that, I said honestly. But if it does, I'll handle it. Jim studied my face for another long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you will, but Sarah, if you need any support, anything at all, you know where to find me. This is my dojo, and I won't tolerate anyone making my students feel unsafe here. The offer was sincere and appreciated, but we both knew that if Marcus decided to escalate this situation, it would likely happen outside these walls, where Master Rodriguez's authority couldn't protect anyone. I thanked him and gathered my things, heading out into the cool evening air with my mind already racing through possibilities and preparations. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I found myself thinking about the phone call I'd received 3 months earlier from my old squad leader, now a sergeant major stationed at Fort Bragg. How's civilian life treating you? He'd asked, and I'd given him the standard answer about adjusting well, finding my rhythm, enjoying the peace and quiet. But tonight's events had reminded me that there's no such thing as truly leaving the military behind. The training becomes part of you, changes how you see the world, and respond to threats. You can hide it, suppress it, pretend it doesn't exist, but it's always there, waiting for the moment when circumstances demand its use. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my driveway. Unknown number, sent just minutes ago. This isn't over. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling that familiar chill of recognition. It seemed Marcus had decided that his humiliation tonight required a response after all. I deleted the message without replying and headed inside to my quiet house, where my teenage daughter was probably doing homework and my husband was likely grading papers in his home office. They had no idea that their suburban evening routine was about to be disrupted by the echoes of my past, catching up with my present. As I changed out of my training clothes and into comfortable pajamas, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared perfectly ordinary, the kind of person you'd pass in a grocery store without a second glance. But behind her eyes was the accumulated weight of experiences that most people couldn't imagine, training that most people would never need, and skills that most people pray they'll never have to use. Tomorrow I would drop my daughter off at school, kiss my husband goodbye, and go to my part-time job at the local library, where the most dangerous thing I encountered was paper cuts and late fees. But tonight I would sleep lightly, one ear tuned for sounds that didn't belong, because Marcus's text message had activated protocols I'd hoped never to need again. The simple suburban mom was about to discover just how complicated life could become when someone threatened the peaceful existence she'd built for herself and her family. And Marcus Thompson was about to learn that some people's warnings should be taken very seriously indeed.